So if you like this video, please check out opforum.com right here, and HL Supply for all your aftermarket chainsaw parts needs. Right now I'm going to put together the 036 clone kit, or 360 clone, or Stihl ms360 clone, whatever you want to call it. We're going to put this together. First things first is going to be getting the cases together. So let's do that. And we're going to use a bunch of HL Supply parts, and we're going to have a lot of fun. There's links in the description, so check those out for HL Supply, for the stuff you might need, for this and that. Yeah, anyway, it's gonna be fun. Okay, let's do this. So let's see what we've got. Okay, I won't go through the full unboxing here, so let's just get to the cases. This is probably cases in here. Okay, and they give you a gasket. I'll go over that in a minute. Like the 660, these come right apart, at least they should. Like the 660, I really do not trust the seals that are in here. And I really don't like the idea, I know lots of guys do it, I don't like the idea of bringing the case halves together and expecting the seals to seal all at the same time. So the first thing that I do on these is I actually tear these seals out. Just don't like the idea of having them pre-installed. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Problem is, if you're going to be doing that, what you really need is a seal kit. So is this the same seal as on here? Same seal. I like having a seal kit like this. So if you're going to buy the whole kit, the chainsaw kit, get a seal kit. HL Supply, they're not that expensive, so you can get them. I just like having this, and honestly I trust these seals a whole lot more than I trust these. So it's just me, just the way I do it. Please check out my other videos on other similar saws, for instance the 660. I've got lots of information on that. Also check out my other videos on the Husqvarna chainsaws, because believe it or not, there's plenty of information there that does kind of cross over. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull these seals out. Now what you don't want to do is you do not want to scratch the edge of the case, because that will mess up the sealing surface. So you have to barely get the screwdriver under there, catch the metal lip of the seal, and give it the heave. There you go. And that seal pops right out. Now, some crazy people might say, well, you can potentially reuse this seal. I don't think that's a good idea. If you can, great. But if you can see, yes, you can see it. Look at that. So there's a circular spring that holds the whole thing together. And that actually is what helps create the seal. That spring is buggered. I just buggered it. So, can you reuse this seal? No. So don't. Get a seal kit. Same thing on the big one here. Get a screwdriver in there, give it a couple of bends. On this one, you're less likely to bugger the mating surface for the seal, because this is steel. This is the metal outer surface of this seal actually seals against the bearing. The bearing is configured in such a way that it's thicker. The outer race is thicker this way, depth-wise. Now on the 660s, the oiler sometimes doesn't sit right, so let's check on that. Now I'm going to eventually go through the whole saw bolt for bolt, so stay tuned for those videos, of course. I have to assume these are the case bolts. There are 5 of them. It looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 2 positioners. So 7 holes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. So 5 case bolts and 2 positioners. Let's check the oiler. So that does not look like it's going to be impeded by the bearing in any way. So this sits right nicely there. It doesn't really look like the bearing is gonna, I can see it this way. I don't think the bearing is gonna interfere with that. So that's good. And these 2 screws for the oiler. They look like blind holes and possibly M4. Probably these 2 short screws. Next thing's next, let's get a gasket in there. I want to use this gasket. Pull the gasket and the seals out of your packaging. Now this tip here actually comes from Walt, who is a fleet command on his YouTube channel. So what he does is he puts these cases together, kind of more or less, and then you measure the bosses. The bearings are already installed, hopefully in the right spot. They look all right. This one may be protruding a little bit, but if you measure between the bosses, 1.176. Others can confirm my measurement, 1.175. Assuming you want the crank centered not between the bearings but between the bosses, then you have to measure the crank. 1.19, 1.20, 1.176 minus 1.120 equals 56 thousandths. Divide that by 2, 28 thousandths. So if you are centering the crank, you want the lobes not quite 30 thousandths on the bosses, off the bosses either side. So what we need to do is we need to make a shim so that when you actually seat the crank, the lobe stops not quite 30 thousandths off the boss. You'll see in a minute. So now that I have the measurement, now all I need to do, we're going to assume that this surface is all flat here. I need to make a shim that's about 28 thousandths thick to stick here. And the shim needs to be small. It doesn't need to be big. Small. I'm actually going to bang on the shim a little bit to thin it out. Good, I actually hit it with a hammer. Now I'm down to about 25 thousandths. Still need to hold it in place though. Need a piece of tape. That has thickness too, so probably about 3 or 4 thousandths. So that'll be an ideal shim when I get a piece of tape. Here's some aluminum tape. About 3 thousandths thick, down to 25 thousandths there. There you go. There's your shim. 28 thousandths thick. Now when you pull the crank through, the lobe is going to stop right here. It's a perfect stop. It'll stop exactly at 28 thousandths off this surface, the boss. So then it'll be perfectly centered, and there's no using a hammer later. No hammers, no hammers. No using a hammer later to center it. There's no need. Okay, we're going to get it centered on the first try. So now we actually want to pull the crank through. So look at the crank, make sure there's nothing weird on it. One thing to check is all the needle bearings are in place. Yeah, all the needle bearings are in place. So now that we have the shim, now we can put the crank in the bearing. A little bit of oil if you want to. Now, you'll notice, unfortunately, that doesn't go. So now we've come to probably the hardest part of putting this whole chainsaw together, is physically getting the crank in the bearings without harming anything. There's lots of ways to do this.
How can you do that?
How can we do that? Well, I have special tools, as it turns out. Special tools to do that. So we've come to the hardest part, and there's lots of ways to do it. Some guys use the hot and cold method, which means that you, in this case, put the crank in the freezer and you can heat the bearing up. Now this does happen to be a nylon cage bearing, so that is not the best of things to do, but you can heat the bearing up in the oven. That does work. You can heat the whole case half up with a heat gun or in the oven somewhere around the 250-degree Fahrenheit. Temperature works all right. But the problem that I have with that is what happens if you lose your heat differential and it doesn't fully seat? Then the whole thing gets stuck, which I've done before, and stuck means stuck. Then you have to use a hammer. So another way you can do it is actually to use a press. So if you have a press, you can actually press here or here and press the whole thing in. The problem I have with a press is that you have the crank is offset here, so if you press directly down, you are squeezing the lobes together, which isn't the best. The other issue with using a press is that you are indeed putting a lateral force here on the bearing. So using a press basically forces the crank through the inner race, but you're putting pressure on the outer race while you're doing that, which you can damage the bearing. It is possible. Now I know a lot of guys have done this for a long time and they don't seem to have any trouble, but I'm not super excited about doing that. So I've developed a set of tools, and this video really isn't about the tools. It's just about the different methods to put cases together. I've developed a set of tools here, and if you're interested in them, certainly you can contact me about that. What you do is you get the crank in, a little bit of oil, get your M12, I believe this is M12 by 1 adapter. These are left-hand thread. And you don't have to put it all the way down, just most of the way. And then your sleeve goes on. The sleeve presses only on the inner race. So what you're doing is you're actually pulling the crank through the inner race, which puts no lateral force on the bearing whatsoever. Washer if you like, and nut. So all we're doing, this sleeve is pressing against the inner race only. This is just a handle. Walt's idea from a Fleet Command. You can check out his channel. We're going to take our ratchet and turn this down. And you can see how the crank is just going to gently glide right on in and through. Not using force, leverage, just cranking this down easy. And when we get to that stop, this is going to just stop. Almost. That's it. That's it, right there. Now we can reverse the ratchet. Hold our handle, reverse the ratchet. Boom. The nut comes off. All this is loosey-goosey, you know, none of this is really tight, so you should be able to remove everything nice and easy. Again, this is left-hand thread on the clutch side. And now our crank is installed in the bearing. So on this particular model, I've noticed something interesting, a little different than the 660. The 660's bearing kind of stood proud of the case. This is really not, but the oiler still is a stop for the bearing. And it looks like the bearing is not fully seated up against the oiler. Now I got the crank in. This is kind of out of order, but I'm going to put the oiler in here, temporary like. two 12mm M4s. And I'm going to tap on the outer race only. Again, we're not going to try to bugger the bearings in there. Going to tap with a punch on the outer race only, and we're going to tap it all the way around to see if we can get the bearing to seat just a little bit further. It would have been easier to do this with the crank out, but that's okay. There we go. Now that's correct. So now the crank lobe is rubbing on our shim basically exactly flush with that. So that's perfect, and we're not interfering with the oiler in any way. In fact, now the bearing is sitting just up flush with the oiler. Okay, so now rotate the crank, peel out the shim, and when you go to install the other side, this is going to be perfectly centered. That's Walt's trick. It's a neat trick. Totally give him credit for that. Now what? Now what we do is we clean. This is all nice and shiny. These edges are shiny. I don't need to shine them up really with a Dremel. But I do need to get the oils off, ideally. So let's do a little bit of brake cleaner, get the oils off. Oh, by the way, repositioning this particular bearing, normally I would do that. Actually, you can do it cold, or you can do it by warming the case up and moving the bearing a little bit. I really don't like using that hammer, but then again, in this particular case, you're not putting any force on anything improperly by hitting the outer race with the punch. You're just going to move the bearing slightly in the case, and that's going to be totally fine. You're not going to actually damage the bearing by doing that. So a little bit of brake cleaner on the mating surface. Same thing with this one. Now, one thing of note next has to do with the positioners. If there's a blind hole that the positioner is going to go into, you have got to make sure it's going to go all the way. Otherwise, getting the case together isn't really going to work. Now, I've made sure that these are seated, so that's fine. You do not have to use sealer. You don't have to. But Walt likes to, and I'm really starting to listen to him more and more, so I've been doing this for a bit, and you know what? I'm really starting to appreciate using the sealer here on the cases. This is threebond's 1184. More is not better. I like to get the surface wet enough that basically the metal doesn't really show. It's not shiny anymore. Look from the side and check everything. And you let this kind of skin up for a minute. It does not need to be... I've let this sit for like 10 minutes while I was fiddling with something else. I tend to like to put the crank in the PTO side first, mainly because I get it positioned best there. I should give a caveat at this point. This is actually the first 036 I've ever worked on. I've done a lot of cases, but, well, a lot being relative. I've done quite a few cases, but I've never seen an 036, so kind of off the cuff here. Again, let that skin up for a bit. So this is the new HL Supply gasket. Now I like to do the PTO side crank first, but I like to get the gasket on whichever side has the positioners because it holds better. A little bit of oil here, doesn't take much. Gotta make sure those positioners are correct. Make sure the connecting rod is out of the way. So now what we're going to do is we're going to get our Generation 2 rod and nut and the whole works again. See if it works on this side. M8 by 1.0 adapter. Sleeve, small sleeve. Threaded rod handle, loosey-goosey, back it off a touch. Washer and nut. I don't happen to have a washer right now. I happen to have a gear wrench this big, so we'll use that. I'm going to pull it through. If the case positioners are not in place, you're sunk. It isn't going to go. Yep, now they're both at the same time. Now I can pay attention to my connecting rod, keeping it straight up. Crank her on down. Man, that works great. Okay. Just, you can see this is coming together. Perfect. A little bit more leverage than the other one, so I don't want to. That's it. That's where she stops. She stops. We're going to go the other way. Handles here. Undo the nut. Washer when I have it. No real need. Handle. Sleeve. Threaded rod adapter. Beautiful. Now we're going to put our case bolts in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They already have Loctite on them, so I'm not going to worry about that. And crank them on down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And your case is together. Now, that rule's perfect. You don't need to hit it with a hammer. Nothing. Leave it. Now, if this is a little on the tight side, what you can do is go back with your sleeve in here and give it just a little extra oomph on the nut, and sometimes that'll loosen it back up. But really, this is very loose. That's fine. Leave it. The hardest part of this whole saw is done. The hardest part is done. Right here. There it is. So on this particular side, I'm going to use a little bit of anaerobic sealer. I like to take a little bit of brake cleaner on a Q-tip and run it around in here just to get off any debris. And then put a tiny bit of oil on the crank, just the crank itself, not the sealing surface. Or not the metal surface, sorry. Super thin layer of anaerobic sealer. For this particular seal, because there's a taper here, you do not need to use the Coke can trick. I have other videos on that if anybody wants to see them. In a deep socket. These will not necessarily go in evenly, just a little below flush. So that's all you need to drive that. That seals in and good. On this side, we'll take the oiler off. Let's get a fresh Q-tip, brake cleaner. Oh, you can always double check, make sure the ring's in there. That's a good idea. That lip isn't too bad. It still isn't great. So you probably need to use the Coke can. Don't want it to spray because you just cleaned the outer race. Just a piece of Coke can. Again, it's in other videos, so you can check those out. So you slide this down over the lip. The Coke can goes over the lip. And so the aluminum guides the rubber over that. And really the rubber is strong enough to resist any burr that might be on the aluminum, but it looks good. But if there's you want to take and peen over the aluminum if you can, that way it's smooth. drive this one flush as well. And then you can take your aluminum can material, and now your seal's perfect. The hardest part of the saw is now done. It's done. The rest is just putting it together, which you can do. I'm going to do the rest of the video, so you can stay tuned for those videos. You can modify it or not, just put together as is, kind of up to you. But that's a start for assembling a Stihl 360 clone, and I'm sure this is pretty valid for Stihl 360s as well. The one kind of weirdness that we had, of course, is always this silly bearing position this direction. It's the same way on the 660s, so I didn't know why I assumed that would be any different here. The ideal thing, just as an addendum here, the ideal thing would be before you try to put the crank in, just put the oiler on, gently heat the case, okay, just the case, and tap this bearing so that it actually comes up and sits right up against the oiler. And once you have that, it'll be in much better position, and then your crank and shim and everything like that will work, and it'll be fully perfect. Last hot tip is taking the tabs off. You want to do it with a razor blade. Again, I'll credit Brad Snelling with that. First saw him do it this way, and it works really well. Keep the razor blade nice and flat. And in this case, I'm going to bring the utility knife in. The angles are weird here. Perfect. Thank you so much for watching this video. The case is now together. Stay tuned for the rest of the whole assembly here. Thank you so much for watching. Do not forget to hit the links in the description for HL Supply and any of the parts that you might need. Certainly in this video, I use the 360 kit, which you can buy from HL Supply. There's a link, there will be a link in the description, as well as the seal kit. I think having the seal kit really helps if you're putting this thing together. I just don't trust the seals that come with this thing. I much prefer the highway stuff, which comes from HL Supply. So again, thank you so much for watching. Appreciate it. Check out my other stuff, and we'll see you later. Don't forget to subscribe.